The tropical heat shimmered across the anchorage at Tawitawi on that June morning in 1944, as Japan's remaining naval power gathered for what would become the Pacific War's defining moment. The Shokaku, a vessel of extraordinary engineering prowess, floated among her sister ships, the Zuikaku and Taiho, representing the last concentrated expression of Japanese carrier ambition. Nearly 850 feet of flight deck had once launched the aircraft that struck Pearl Harbor 3 decades earlier, measured in months rather than years. This same ship would now face her reckoning, though the 1,663 men aboard her could scarcely imagine the fate that awaited them in the coming days. Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa commanded from his flagship's bridge as the mobile fleet began its sortie on June 19th. The assembled force presented an imposing spectacle: 3 fleet carriers, accompanied by the battleships Yamato and Musashi, 13 cruisers, including the Atago, Takao, Maya, and Chokai, and 28 destroyers forming protective screens around the capital ships. Yet appearances deceived. This was not the overwhelming force that had dominated from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean just 2 years prior. Japan's desperate gamble to reverse the war's momentum would soon reveal itself as a catastrophic miscalculation. The strategic landscape that confronted Japan's military leadership in mid-1944 presented an increasingly grim tableau. The empire's rapid expansion of 1941 and 1942 had given way to contraction under American pressure that seemed relentless in its intensity. The Gilbert Islands had fallen. Truk had been neutralized. Now American forces were assaulting Saipan in the Marianas, a development that held ominous implications for Japan's future. The capture of these islands would bring American B-29 Superfortress bombers within striking distance of Tokyo itself. The Doolittle raid of 1942 had demonstrated the psychological impact of enemy bombing on the home islands. Now that capability would be permanent and devastating. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, understood perfectly the catastrophic consequences of losing the Marianas. Control of these islands represented more than territorial possession. They constituted the strategic threshold between Japan's shrinking empire and the home islands themselves. Their loss would sever communications with the resource-rich southern territories and expose Japan to the strategic bombing campaign that would eventually reduce her cities to ash. In response to this existential threat, Toyoda authorized Operation Ago, a complex naval strategy designed to leverage whatever advantages Japan retained. Japanese carrier aircraft possessed greater range than their American counterparts, 300 miles compared to 200 miles for American planes. Land-based aviation from airfields on Guam, Rota, Tinian, and Yap would provide preliminary strikes to weaken the American fleet before carrier aircraft engaged. Japanese battleship crews possessed superior training in night combat operations. These advantages, Toyoda believed, might prove decisive if the mobile fleet could engage the American carriers while they remained committed to supporting the Saipan landings. The reality, however, presented a far bleaker picture than official optimism acknowledged. The Japanese Naval Aviation Service had been systematically destroyed through attrition. The veterans who had executed the precision attacks at Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and Colombo, men who embodied decades of accumulated experience, were dead, killed in the grinding battles of Midway, the Solomon Islands, and Santa Cruz. Their replacements had been rushed through abbreviated training programs that provided perhaps 200 flying hours compared to the 800-plus hours accumulated by American pilots. This disparity in experience would prove fatal when the two air forces clashed. The fuel situation presented another crippling vulnerability. Japan's merchant marine, hunted systematically by American submarines, could no longer reliably transport refined petroleum from the East Indies to the home islands. The mobile fleet operated on unrefined Tarakan crude oil pumped directly from Borneo's wells. This heavy, sulfurous petroleum produced thick, black smoke that made the fleet easily visible to enemy observers, clogged the ship's boilers, and reduced maximum speed. Engine room crews worked in hellish conditions as the crude oil released toxic fumes that made extended operations below decks nearly unbearable. Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded the American Fifth Fleet, a force of overwhelming superiority, 15 carriers carrying 956 aircraft, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. The Americans held decisive advantages in numbers, pilot quality, radar technology, and logistics. Yet Ozawa hoped that tactical brilliance and surprise might offset these disadvantages. The Japanese admiral's plan possessed elegant simplicity: maintain his carriers beyond the range of American aircraft while using his own longer-ranged planes to strike the American fleet. Land-based aviation would execute preliminary attacks, weakening the American defenses before the carrier engagement. The combined assault would theoretically overwhelm American defenses and create opportunities for decisive strikes. Ozawa divided his fleet into 3 groups. Van Force, under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, with light carriers. Force A, under Ozawa himself aboard the Taiho, accompanied by the Shokaku and Zuikaku. Force B, under Rear Admiral Takagi Joshima, with additional carriers. This disposition reflected Ozawa's hope that tactical distribution would complicate American defensive efforts. Admiral Spruance faced a different but equally challenging problem. His primary mission was protecting the amphibious forces at Saipan, yet he also needed to engage and destroy the Japanese fleet if opportunity arose. Intelligence reports from coast watchers and signals intercepts indicated that a major Japanese force approached, but its exact composition and intentions remained unclear. Spruance positioned Task Force 58, divided into 4 carrier groups west of the Marianas, creating a barrier between the Japanese and the invasion beaches. The American submarine force, under Admiral Charles Lockwood, played a crucial but often overlooked role in this strategic chess match. Lockwood had studied Japanese naval patterns and correctly anticipated that any relief force would transit the Philippine Sea. He established the NA line, a series of patrol zones manned by submarines positioned as an early warning system. 4 submarines, USS Albacore, USS Bang, USS Finback, and USS Stingray, occupied precise coordinates, forming a net through which the Japanese fleet would likely pass. Yet another submarine, not part of Lockwood's carefully planned deployment, would achieve one of the submarine war's most significant victories. USS Kavala, on her maiden war patrol, would soon intersect with historical destiny. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Herman J. Shamter Kostler, a 36-year-old career naval officer from Ohio who had graduated from Annapolis, had received orders to patrol east of the Philippines. Changing circumstances would place his boat directly in the path of Ozawa's advancing fleet. The USS Kavala SS-244 represented the pinnacle of American submarine design in 1944. Built at the Electric Boat Company's shipyard in Groton, Connecticut, she was a Gato-class fleet submarine, one of 77 boats of her class that would serve as the backbone of the American submarine force. Laid down on March 4, 1943, and launched on November 14 of the same year, Kavala was commissioned on February 29, 1944, under Kostler's command. At 311 feet 9 inches in length and displacing 526 tons on the surface, she was a formidable weapon. Her pressure hull, constructed of high tensile steel, could withstand depths of 400 feet, though her test depth was officially listed at 300 feet. Powered by 4 Fairbanks Morse diesel engines generating 5,400 horsepower on the surface and 4 General Electric motors producing 2,740 horsepower when submerged, Kabbalah achieved speeds of 20.25 knots surfaced and 8.75 knots submerged. Her range of 11,000 nautical miles on the surface at 10 knots allowed extended operations, though this was reduced to 48 hours at 2 knots when operating on battery power underwater. The submarine carried 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, with storage for 24 Mark 14 torpedoes. Each Mark 14 measured 20 feet 6 inches long, weighed 3,280 pounds, and carried a 623-pound Torpex warhead, capable of breaking the back of all but the most heavily armored warships. By 1944, the troubled history of the Mark 14, with its defective magnetic exploder and tendency to run deeper than set, had largely been resolved, making Kabbala's torpedoes far more reliable than those used earlier in the war. Secondary armament included a 5-inch 25 caliber deck gun with 200 rounds and 240 caliber machine guns for anti-aircraft defense. Kabbala's crew of 72 officers and enlisted men had spent 3 months in intensive training before departing on their first war patrol. The submarine community was unique within the Navy. Officers and enlisted men lived and worked in extraordinarily close quarters, creating a level of interdependence unknown in the surface fleet. Every man had to qualify on every system aboard the boat. Lives depended on each crew member being able to perform any critical function in an emergency. The submarine's sophisticated fire control systems represented the cutting edge of submarine warfare. The SJ surface search radar could detect enemy vessels at ranges up to 12 miles in good conditions. The SD air search radar provided warning of approaching aircraft. The ST periscope radar, though temperamental, allowed precise range finding during attack approaches. Below the waterline, the JK sound gear enabled the submarine to track targets acoustically. The Torpedo Data Computer, TDC, an electromechanical analog device, calculated firing solutions by integrating target bearing, range, speed, and course with the submarine's own movement. Kabbala departed Midway Island on June 4, 1944, for her maiden war patrol. The boat had arrived at Pearl Harbor in mid-May following a 5,000-mile journey from Connecticut via the Panama Canal, then proceeded to Midway for final preparations. During her brief stay, Kostler and his officers received final briefings, loaded fresh provisions and ammunition, and made last-minute adjustments. The submarine's assigned patrol area encompassed the waters east of the Philippines, specifically the approaches to San Bernardino Strait and Surigao Strait, the two primary passages through the Philippine archipelago. These strategic waterways served as highways for Japanese naval and merchant traffic moving between the home islands and the resource-rich territories of the Netherlands East Indies. The first days of the patrol proved uneventful as Kabbala moved westward across the vast Pacific. The crew settled into the monotonous routine of submarine operations, 4 hours on watch, 8 hours off, with free time divided between sleeping, eating, and maintaining the boat's complex machinery. The submarine ran on the surface at night, her diesels charging the massive battery banks while making good speed toward the patrol area. During daylight hours, she often submerged to avoid detection by enemy aircraft, creeping along at 3 knots to conserve battery power. On June 8, while transiting the waters near Marcus Island, approximately 1,200 miles southeast of Tokyo, Kabbala experienced an unusual incident. The officer of the deck reported a sudden jolt and vibration from the stern, followed by what appeared to be a pool of blood in the boat's wake. Kostler ordered all stop and sent men to inspect the propellers and stern planes. Finding no damage, he concluded they had struck a small whale, one of many that inhabited these waters. The weather deteriorated on June 14 as Kabbala approached her assigned patrol area. Barometric pressure dropped steadily and seas built to 15 feet, sending solid water over the bridge and down the conning tower hatch. The boat pitched and rolled violently, making normal operations nearly impossible. Men were thrown from their bunks, dishes crashed in the galley, and several crew members suffered severe seasickness. Kostler attempted to transmit a weather report to Pearl Harbor, but the storm's intensity prevented successful transmission. After fighting the typhoon for 18 hours, he ordered the boat submerged to ride out the storm in the relative calm below the surface. As the storm passed on June 15, Kavala surfaced to find clearing skies and moderating seas. Almost immediately, the radio operator intercepted a contact report from USS Flying Fish, another submarine operating nearby. Flying Fish had spotted a Japanese task force moving east at high speed, but had been unable to gain an attack position. The sighting electrified Kavala's crew. Major Japanese fleet units had been scarce since the battles of 1942, and the opportunity to engage capital ships was exactly what every submarine commander dreamed of. Kostler immediately ordered a course change to intercept the reported contact and increased speed to 17 knots, pushing the diesels hard despite the still rough seas. He made contact with USS Pipefish, also responding to Flying Fish's report, and the two submarines agreed to conduct a coordinated search. Throughout the night of June 15 to 16, lookouts strained their eyes searching for the distinctive silhouettes of Japanese warships, while the radar operator continuously swept the SJ scope for electronic contacts. Dawn on June 16 brought disappointment. Despite covering over 200 miles during the night search, neither submarine had found the Japanese task force. Kostler reluctantly concluded that the enemy had either changed course or increased speed beyond his calculations. He ordered Kavala back to her assigned patrol area, though the brief taste of potential action had energized the crew. Just before midnight on June 16, the SJ radar detected multiple contacts to the southwest. The operator reported what appeared to be 5 or 6 vessels moving at moderate speed. 2 large contacts that could be tankers or cargo ships, escorted by 3 or 4 smaller vessels, probably destroyers or escort vessels. This was exactly the type of target submarines were expected to engage, and Kostler ordered battle stations as Kavala began her approach. The attack approach proved frustrating. The Japanese escorts were alert and aggressive, constantly pinging with active sonar and making random course changes. Every time Kavala maneuvered into a favorable position, a destroyer would suddenly turn toward them, forcing Kostler to go deep and evade. After 3 hours of cat-and-mouse maneuvering, during which the submarine never got closer than 4,000 yards to the main targets, a destroyer charged directly at Kavala's position. Kostler ordered an emergency dive to 300 feet, rigged for silent running, and waited as the escort passed overhead, the sound of its screws clearly audible through the hull. When Kavala finally surfaced at 0200 on June 17, the convoy had vanished into the darkness. Kostler was frustrated but philosophical. Such was the nature of submarine warfare. What he didn't know was that the convoy he had been pursuing consisted of fleet oilers, supporting Ozawa's mobile fleet. The afternoon of June 17 brought new orders from Submarine Command. Based on multiple submarine sightings and signal intelligence, Admiral Lockwood was repositioning his boats to intercept what was clearly a major Japanese fleet movement. Kavala was ordered to take position at 13G00 north, 137G0000 east, approximately 1350 miles west of Guam. Kostler plotted the new position and ordered a course change, pushing the boat hard to reach the assigned coordinates before the expected Japanese arrival. At 1945 hours on June 17, as Kavala raced toward her new position, the SJ radar operator reported a faint contact bearing 290 degrees at a range of 30,000 yards. The contact was intermittent, appearing and disappearing with each radar sweep, suggesting it was at the extreme range of the equipment. Kostler ordered a course change to close the contact and increased speed to maximum. As the range decreased, more contacts appeared on the radar screen. First 2, then 4, then 7 distinct returns. By 2015 hours, Kostler had identified what could only be a major Japanese task force. The radar returns indicated at least 7 large vessels moving at 19 knots on a base course of 045 degrees. The formation was zigzagging, a standard anti-submarine tactic, but the base course suggested they were heading toward the Marianas. Through careful plotting, Kostler identified what appeared to be at least 1 aircraft carrier, several possible battleships or heavy cruisers, and screening destroyers. This was no merchant convoy. Kabbalah had stumbled upon a major element of the Japanese fleet. The decision Kostler faced was one of the most difficult in submarine warfare. His boat was in perfect position to attack with the Japanese force approaching his position. A spread of torpedoes fired at the right moment could damage or sink a capital ship. But Kostler also understood the strategic importance of his discovery. Admiral Spruance's fleet needed to know the location, composition, and course of this Japanese force. The information was potentially more valuable than any damage Kavala alone could inflict. After a brief consultation with his executive officer, Kostler made the harder choice. He would forgo the immediate attack and surface to transmit a contact report. Surfacing a submarine in proximity to enemy warships violated every instinct of submarine warfare. But Kostler knew the stakes. At 2445, after the Japanese force had passed beyond visual range, Kavala surfaced into the tropical darkness. The radio operator immediately began transmitting. Large enemy task force. Latitude 13 degrees north, longitude 36 degrees 30 minutes east. Base course 045 degrees. Speed 19 knots. Composition: at least 1 carrier, several battleships or cruisers, multiple destroyers. The message was received at Pearl Harbor and immediately relayed to Admiral Spruance aboard USS Indianapolis. This was the first definitive report of the approaching Japanese carrier force, confirming what American intelligence had suspected. Spruance now knew that a major fleet engagement was imminent and could position his forces accordingly. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, though Kostler didn't know it at the time, had effectively begun with Kavala's contact report. After transmitting the message and receiving acknowledgement, Kavala submerged and attempted to regain contact with the Japanese force. Despite running at maximum submerged speed, the submarine could not overtake the faster surface ships. By dawn on June 18, Kostler reluctantly abandoned the pursuit and returned to his assigned patrol position. The crew was disappointed at missing an attack opportunity, but Kostler assured them that their contact report had been invaluable to the fleet. Throughout June 18, Kavala remained submerged during daylight hours, surfacing only briefly after dark to receive radio traffic and recharge batteries. The airwaves were alive with encrypted messages as American and Japanese forces maneuvered for position. Kostler could sense that something major was developing, but had no clear picture of the larger battle. His orders were to maintain position and attack any enemy vessels that entered his patrol area. The crew spent the day conducting routine maintenance, checking torpedoes, and preparing for action they sensed was imminent. At 0345 on June 19, the quiet routine was shattered when a low-flying aircraft passed directly over the submarine. The officer of the deck barely had time to sound the diving alarm before the plane roared overhead, its engine noise drowning out all other sounds. Kavala dived, her bow pointing sharply downward as the ballast tanks flooded. The crew waited tensely for the explosion of aerial bombs, but none came. Either the aircraft hadn't spotted them in the darkness, or it had no weapons to drop. As dawn broke on June 19, 1944, Kavala found herself in an extraordinarily fortuitous position. Unknown to Kostler, The complex movements of the Japanese and American fleets had placed his submarine directly in the path of Ozawa's main carrier force. The Japanese admiral, believing his position still undetected, had launched his first strike wave against the American carriers at 0830. Now, as these aircraft departed, the Japanese carriers turned into the wind to recover their combat air patrol and prepare for subsequent launches. At 20:48, Kabala's sound operator reported high-speed screws bearing 070 degrees. Kostler raised the periscope for a brief observation and immediately ordered it lowered. On the horizon, he had spotted the distinctive pagoda-style masts characteristic of Japanese warships. He ordered battle stations submerged, and the crew rushed to their combat positions with practiced efficiency. The torpedo room crews checked their weapons one final time. The diving officer fine-tuned the boat's trim, and the plotting party prepared to develop a firing solution. At 1:52, Kostler made his second periscope observation. This time, the view took his breath away. A large aircraft carrier, accompanied by at least one heavy cruiser and several destroyers, was approaching from the northeast at approximately 20 knots. The carrier was recovering aircraft with planes circling overhead, waiting their turn to land. The flight deck was crowded with aircraft that had already recovered, their wings still extended. Kostler estimated the range at 12,000 yards. Too far for an effective torpedo attack, but the carrier's course would bring it much closer. The next 15 minutes required exceptional submarine handling. Kostler needed to maneuver Kabala into an optimal firing position without being detected by the screening destroyers. He could only afford brief periscope observations as the escorts were actively searching for submarines. The TDC operator continuously updated the firing solution based on Kostler's observations and the sound bearings provided by the sonar operator. The carrier was identified as a Shokaku-class vessel based on its distinctive profile, the small island structure offset to starboard, the massive flight deck, and the unique arrangement of anti-aircraft guns. At 11:10, Kostler made what he intended to be his final observation before firing. The carrier, now positively identified as either Shokaku or Zuikaku based on the pagoda mast and flight deck configuration, was at a range of 5,000 yards and closing. The angle on the bow was nearly perfect for a broadside shot. However, the destroyer Urakaze was moving into a position that would block the torpedo run. Kostler had to make a split-second decision, wait for the destroyer to clear and risk losing the shot, or fire immediately and hope the destroyer didn't interfere with the torpedo tracks. At 11:18, with Shokaku at a range of 1,200 yards, Kostler made his decision. "Fire one!" he commanded, and the first torpedo left Kabala's number 1 tube with the characteristic shudder and high-pressure air discharge. At 8-second intervals, 5 more torpedoes followed, spreading in a fan pattern calculated to ensure at least some hits, regardless of any last-minute course changes by the target. The torpedo run was set for 15 feet, shallow enough to strike above the carrier's armor belt, but deep enough to avoid surface turbulence. Even as the 6th torpedo was leaving its tube, Kostler ordered, "Take her deep, flood negative, full dive on the bow planes." Kabala's bow angled sharply downward as tons of water flooded into the negative tank. The submarine was passing 100 feet when the first explosion resonated through the water. A deep, satisfying boom that brought smiles to the crew's faces despite their precarious situation. 8 seconds later, a second explosion, then a third. Kostler had hoped for 4 hits, but 3 was an excellent result against a maneuvering target. Aboard Shokaku, the first indication of danger came when a lookout spotted torpedo wakes approaching from starboard. The officer of the watch immediately ordered full right rudder and emergency speed, but it was too late. The first torpedo struck amidship at frame 45, tearing a massive hole in the hull and flooding the number 3 boiler room. The second hit further forward, destroying aviation fuel bunkers and starting fires among the aircraft parked on the hangar deck. The third torpedo struck near the forward elevator, causing it to jam in the raised position and rendering flight operations impossible. The carrier immediately took on a severe list to starboard as thousands of tons of water poured through the gaping holes in her hull. Damage control parties struggled to contain the flooding, but the situation was complicated by the aviation gasoline fires spreading through the hangar spaces. The ship's commanding officer, Captain Matsubara Hiroshi, ordered counterflooding to correct the list, but this only reduced the carrier's reserve buoyancy. Within minutes of the torpedo strikes, Shokaku had slowed to 12 knots and was clearly in mortal danger. Back aboard Kavala, the celebration was short-lived. 2 minutes after firing, the first depth charges detonated above and behind the submarine. The Japanese escorts had either detected the submarine's periscope or traced back the torpedo wakes to their point of origin. Now began a deadly game of cat and mouse as Kavala went deep and silent, trying to evade the destroyers hunting her. The submarine passed 300 feet, approaching her test depth as more depth charges exploded in patterns around her estimated position. The depth charge attack was methodical and relentless. The Japanese destroyers worked in coordination, one maintaining sonar contact while the other made attack runs. The charges were set to detonate at varying depths, creating a three-dimensional kill zone that Kavala had to somehow evade. At 11:35, a pattern of 6 charges detonated so close that cork insulation rained from the overhead. Light bulbs shattered, and the submarine's hull groaned under the pressure waves. Kostler ordered silent running, shutting down all non-essential equipment to reduce noise signature. The crew removed their shoes, moving about in stocking feet to minimize sound. The air conditioning was secured, and within minutes, the temperature inside the submarine began rising toward unbearable levels. Men stood at their stations sweating profusely, breathing shallowly to conserve the increasingly stale air. In the maneuvering room, electricians watched the battery gauges slowly decline, calculating how long they could maintain submerged operations. At 11:44, the sound operator reported a destroyer passing directly overhead. The crew could hear the rhythmic thrashing of the escort screws growing louder, reaching a crescendo as the vessel passed over them, then gradually fading. Everyone braced for the depth charges that would surely follow, but surprisingly, none came. Either the destroyer had lost contact or was repositioning for a better attack angle. Kostler used this respite to order a course change, hoping to slip away from the search area while the destroyers regrouped. For the next 2 hours, Kavala played a desperate game of evasion. Kostler varied the submarine's depth between 200 and 400 feet, changed course frequently but gradually, and used the temperature gradients in the water to hide from Japanese sonar. The depth charging continued sporadically with patterns detonating at various distances. By 1300, the sound operator reported that only one destroyer remained in close proximity. The others had apparently returned to escort the damaged carrier. At 1332, a series of peculiar noises began emanating from the direction of the torpedo attack. The sound operator described them as breaking up noises, the characteristic sound of a ship's hull collapsing under pressure. These continued intermittently for the next half hour, suggesting that Shokaku was suffering progressive structural failure. At 1428, 4 tremendous explosions shook Kavala despite the distance. These were not depth charges, but something far more powerful, likely the detonation of Shokaku's ammunition magazines or aviation fuel bunkers. As Kavala continued her evasion, the drama aboard Shokaku reached its climax. The carrier's damage control efforts had initially shown promise, with the crew managing to contain the initial flooding and extinguish some fires. However, the structural damage was too severe. The torpedo hits had not only opened the hull to the sea, but had also damaged critical fuel lines and ventilation systems. Aviation gasoline vapors, heavier than air, accumulated in the lower compartments despite efforts to ventilate them. At approximately 1400, these vapors reached an ignition source, possibly a spark from damaged electrical equipment or hot metal from the earlier fires. The resulting explosion tore through Shokaku's interior, destroying what remained of her watertight integrity. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the armored flight deck several feet, sending aircraft and crew members flying. Secondary explosions followed as ready ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns cooked off in the intense heat. Captain Matsubara ordered abandoned ship at 1410, but many of the crew were already trapped below decks by fire, flooding, or structural collapse. The carrier's list increased rapidly to 45 degrees, making movement on deck nearly impossible. Men slid down the canting flight deck into the water, where they struggled to swim clear of the sinking ship's suction. The destroyer Urakaze and light cruiser Yahagi moved in to rescue survivors, their crews throwing lines and life rings to men in the water. At 1501, Shokaku capsized to starboard and sank stern first. As she went down, more explosions erupted from within her hull, possibly from boilers contacting cold seawater or remaining ammunition detonating. The carrier that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor participated in the Coral Sea battle and survived numerous engagements throughout the war, finally met her end in the depths of the Philippine Sea. Of her crew of 1,603 officers and men, 1,272 perished, including Captain Matsubara, who chose to go down with his ship. Approximately 590 survivors were rescued by the Japanese escorts. By 1500, Cavala's battery was approaching exhaustion, and the air inside the submarine was barely breathable. Carbon dioxide levels had risen to dangerous levels, causing headaches and lethargy among the crew. Kostler made the decision to come to periscope depth despite the possibility of enemy destroyers still searching for them. To his relief, the periscope revealed empty ocean in all directions. The Japanese escorts had departed either to rescue Shokaku survivors or to rejoin what remained of their carrier force. At 1900, after more than 7 hours submerged, Kavala surfaced into the tropical twilight. The crew immediately started the diesel engines, bringing blessed fresh air into the fetid submarine. Men stumbled topside, gulping the clean ocean air and cooling themselves in the spray breaking over the bow. The batteries began their long recharge cycle, and the air conditioning was restored, gradually bringing the interior temperature down from its peak of 105 degrees Fahrenheit. Kostler's first priority was to report the attack to Pearl Harbor. The radio operator transmitted, "Attacked Shokaku-class carrier. 3 hits observed. Heavy explosions heard after going deep. Believe target sank. Position 11 Gray 50s north, 37 Gray 57 east." The message was received with jubilation at submarine headquarters. Admiral Lockwood himself drafted the reply, "Well done, Kavala. Achievement beyond expectations." The strategic impact of Shokaku's loss extended far beyond the elimination of a single carrier. Coming simultaneously with the loss of Taiho to USS Albacore's torpedoes, the Japanese carrier force had lost 2 of its 3 fleet carriers in a single day. More critically, hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable aircrew were lost. Japanese naval aviation, already weakened by attrition, would never recover from the losses suffered on June 19, 1944, a day that would become known to American aviators as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The submarine continued her patrol for another 6 weeks, though no action would match the intensity of June 19. On July 1, Kavala arrived at the newly captured port of Saipan for fuel and provisions. The scene that greeted them was surreal. Hundreds of ships anchored in the harbor, the island still smoking from the ongoing battle, and the constant thunder of naval gunfire supporting marine operations ashore. Staff officers from Admiral Spruance and Admiral Turner came aboard to debrief Kostler and congratulate the crew personally. The full magnitude of Cavala's achievement became clear when combined with the broader results of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese had lost 3 aircraft carriers, over 600 aircraft, and suffered irreplaceable losses in trained aircrew. The mobile fleet, Japan's last hope for offensive naval operations, had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. While the war would continue for another 14 months, Japan's fate had been sealed in the waters of the Philippine Sea. The sinking of Shokaku represented more than the loss of a single warship. It symbolized the complete reversal of fortune in the Pacific War. The carrier that had launched the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, participating in Japan's stunning early victories, had been destroyed by a submarine from the nation she had helped awaken to war. The irony was not lost on naval historians or the American public when the story was released after the war's end. Cavala's success on her first war patrol established her as one of the most celebrated submarines in the Pacific Fleet. She would complete 5 more war patrols, sinking 3 additional Japanese vessels. Her most significant achievement remained that single spread of torpedoes fired on June 19, 1944. Lieutenant Commander Kostler was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions, and Cavala received the Presidential Unit Citation for her first patrol. The submarine's achievement must be understood within the broader context of the submarine war against Japan. American submarines, comprising less than 2% of the Navy's personnel, accounted for 55% of all Japanese maritime losses during the war. They sank 201 warships totaling 530,000 tons and 1,130 merchant vessels totaling 4.9 million tons. This campaign effectively strangled Japan's island empire, cutting off vital resources and isolating outlying garrisons. The sinking of capital ships like Shokaku grabbed headlines, but the steady attrition of Japan's merchant marine ultimately proved decisive. The tactical lessons from Cavala's attack influenced submarine doctrine for the remainder of the war. Kostler's decision to report the enemy task force before attacking demonstrated the strategic value of submarines as scouts for the fleet. His patience in achieving an optimal firing position, making only 3 periscope observations during the approach phase, became a textbook example of fire control technique. The successful evasion of the subsequent depth charge attack validated American submarine construction techniques and damage control training. Post-war analysis revealed interesting discrepancies between American and Japanese accounts of the attack. While Kostler reported 3 torpedo hits, some Japanese survivors insisted 4 torpedoes struck home. Japanese records indicate that 105 depth charges were dropped during the attack, with 56 detonating close to Cavala. The exact cause of the final explosions that doomed Shokaku remains debated. Whether it was aviation fuel vapors, ammunition magazines, or a combination of factors, what remained undisputed was that Cavala's attack, combined with Albacore's torpedoing of Taiho, eliminated 2/3 of Ozawa's carrier strength in a single day. The human cost of Shokaku's sinking deserves remembrance. The 1,272 Japanese sailors who perished were not fanatics or war criminals, but professional seamen doing their duty as they understood it. Many were conscripts barely out of their teens. Others were veteran sailors who had served aboard Shokaku since her commissioning. Their deaths, while necessary in the context of total war, represent individual tragedies multiplied 1,200 times over. Among the dead were many veteran officers who had served with distinction throughout the war. The location of Shokaku's wreck remains unknown to this day. Unlike many other major warships from the Pacific War that have been discovered by deep-sea exploration teams, Shokaku's final resting place in the Philippine Sea has yet to be located. The carrier lies somewhere in the depths of the ocean, her hull likely broken by the massive internal explosions that sealed her fate. For the families of the 1,027 men who went down with her, the lack of a known gravesite remains a source of continuing grief. Kabala herself survived the war and continued to serve the United States Navy in various capacities until 1969. She was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1982 and is now preserved as a museum ship at Seawolf Park in Galveston, Texas. Visitors can walk through her narrow compartments, peer through the periscope that Kostler used to target Shokaku, and stand in the control room where life and death decisions were made in split seconds. The submarine stands as a tangible reminder of the courage and skill of the silent service. The strategic implications of the Battle of the Philippine Sea and Kabala's role in it extended beyond the immediate military victory. The destruction of Japanese carrier aviation opened the way for the liberation of the Philippines, the invasion of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, and ultimately the planned invasion of Japan itself. While that invasion proved unnecessary due to Japan's surrender following the atomic bombings, the naval supremacy established in June 1944 made those subsequent operations possible. In the grand narrative of World War II, the sinking of Shokaku by Kabala represents a perfect microcosm of the Pacific War's evolution. The Japanese Navy that had seemed invincible in 1941-42 had been systematically destroyed by American industrial might, technological superiority, and the courage of individual sailors and submariners. The hunter had become the hunted, and the empire that had gambled on a quick victory found itself facing inevitable defeat. Today, as tensions again rise in the Western Pacific, the lessons of the Philippine Sea remain relevant. The importance of submarine warfare, the value of intelligence and reconnaissance, the critical nature of trained personnel, and the decisive impact of technological advantage all echo through the decades. The story of Kabala and Shokaku reminds us that naval supremacy once lost is difficult to regain, and that wars at sea can be decided in moments by the actions of relatively small units. The morning of June 19, 1944, had begun with the Imperial Japanese Navy launching what it hoped would be a decisive counterstrike against the American invasion of the Marianas. By sunset, that hope had been shattered, with 2 fleet carriers on the ocean floor and hundreds of aircraft destroyed. Among the many heroes of that day, the 72 men aboard USS Kabala had played a pivotal role, demonstrating that in naval warfare, a single submarine with a determined crew could change the course of history. Their achievement stands as a testament to the submariners' motto, "We sink them regardless." As Herman Kostler would later reflect in his memoirs, the attack on Shokaku was both the culmination of years of training and preparation, and a matter of being in the right place at the right time. But as Admiral Chester Nimitz observed, luck is frequently the reward of those who are prepared to take advantage of opportunities. Kabala was prepared. The opportunity presented itself, and the result was one of the most significant submarine attacks of the Second World War. The submarine that had left Groton just months earlier as another boat in the Gato class had earned her place in naval history, writing her name in the annals of the silent service with torpedoes rather than ink.